We started this new series, No Pain, No Gain, last week. A series in which we are talking about the comforts and the discomforts of life and what kind of lessons, if there are lessons, that we can learn from the pain, from the discomfort that we sometimes experience in life. Now, when we were still in South Africa, in Cape Town, every Easter weekend there was a huge marathon that took place. They say it's the most beautiful marathon in the world. It's called the Two Oceans Marathon. So you literally run around the Cape, and on the one side you will see the Indian Ocean. As you go around the point, you will see the Atlantic Ocean. So that's why it's the Two Oceans Marathon. And in the phase when we were church planting, before we had services over Easter, we volunteered as marshals at this marathon. Now, it's an ultra marathon, so 56 kilometers. And I think it's 11,000 people that do the ultra marathon, and then there's another bunch that do the half marathon. But we were at the last couple of kilometers on the steep mountain pass that goes down towards the end of the ultra marathon. And it was always so interesting to see the people that competed. You always had this flock right at the beginning of a couple of really short people. That's interesting to me. They're not really tall, but they're so fast. It's like they're sprinting 56 kilometers. I'm like, there's something wrong with you if you can do that. But they just go like super focused. They don't greet you. They don't wave at you. Like they are going for the prize, right? And then about an hour later, the race slowly starts trickling through, but that's where you now start to see the effects of pain on people's faces, right? Some greet you, some thank you. We have cat eyes in South Africa, so it's these little markers in the road that has a reflector on it, but they stand out a bit. And they have tried everything. They would like put foam stuff around these little cat eyes, but people would run, and by that time they're so tired they don't lift their feet anymore. So if they are at the wrong spot on that road, they get hooked on this and they fall. And this was the crazy part. They are so tired, they don't put their hands out. They're like, whatever is hitting the ground is taking the punishment, and most often is their faces, right? So I would run over, and it always happened in front of my spot. And I would run over, and it's like bleeding everywhere. And I'm like, do you want to stop? And they're like, no, this is the fifth time I felt like this. And I'm like, whoa. And they just keep going. And I'm like, it's blood everywhere, but they keep going. And then you did get the people who show up there, and they're like, I'm done. And I'm like, there's no blood coming out of you. Like, why are you done? It's like my leg or whatever. But it was so interesting to observe all of these people where some quit, some pushed through the pain, some pushed through the falls, and got to the other side. And it's interesting how life can be so similar to an ultramarathon, right? There is one thing that we can be assured of, and that is that life will be filled with discomforts and with uneasiness and with pain and with hardships. That's just part of the broken world that we live in. But it's interesting that sometimes we are at that edge of giving up, and other times we feel strong to push through. But life is pretty much like this ultra marathon. And over the last 2 years, I'm certain that a lot of you experienced more discomfort than you were used to previously because of COVID and everything that came with it. So today, we're going to talk about our second title in this series called Discomfort is Underrated. Last week we spoke about comfort and how we often try to find happiness in the comforts of life, and it doesn't bring true joy to us, right? So comfort is often overrated. But the question is, could discomfort, the thing that we all try to avoid, the pain that we try to get away from, could that actually be good in some ways? Could it be the discomfort is underrated? And we started reading the story last week of a young man named Joseph in the first book of the Bible, in the book Genesis. And I challenge you then to read this week 4 chapters. What were we reading? Chapter 37, 38, 39, and 40, I think. So 4 chapters, and a chapter is not pages, guys. It's like a little piece. So if you haven't started that yet, you're not too late. You can still catch up, although you might not know everything that we're going to be talking about today. If you don't have a Bible, come and speak to me. We've got Bibles for you, or download the Bible app on your phone. But I challenge you to go and read it, because today the story of this young man that lived a life of comfort up to a certain point where his brothers had enough of his arrogance. They threw him up in a pit, sold him as a slave to slave traders. Today we're going to continue reading his story because he had some significant ups and downs. But let me first give you a little bit of context. Okay, he's in the pit, naked, stripped. They sell him to slave traders. They take him to Egypt. A man named Potiphar buys him, and he becomes a slave in his household. But Joseph just did what he did so well that Potiphar was like, I'm just going to put you in charge of everything. Everything I have, like my businesses, my animals, my children, like you run the household completely. And Joseph did it incredibly. But he was so good, and the Bible says he was so good looking, that Potiphar's wife had a thing for him. And she tried to convince him to have an affair with her, to sleep with her. And Joseph was a man of principle. He said, like, this is not what my God desires of my life, but it's also not fair towards Potiphar, who's given me this much. So finally, this woman was so sneaky that she one day traps him alone in the house. She grabs a hold of his cloak, and this young man is like, I need to get out of here. He runs so fast, he leaves his cloak behind. And this was just a point where this woman had it. She's like, this guy's never going to give in. So she told her husband that Joseph tried to rape her. So innocently, he goes to jail. And not just any jail, the royal jail where all the really bad people were kept and the king's prisoners. And he goes there to spend a couple of years in jail. And I'm like, at this point, this man had comfort, then discomfort, then comfort in Potiphar's house, and now discomfort again because he's in jail. And I want us to start reading where he is in jail, where he's just thrown into jail from Genesis 39. So you might have already read this piece this week, Genesis 39 from verse 20 to 23. Okay, so this is what we read. So this is Potiphar. He took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord, I want you to say that with me. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. Guys, what good can come from a prison, right? What good can come from being sold as a slave? What I love about the story of Joseph is he faced these really hard, painful situations from the moment where his own blood brothers sell him as a slave to a point where he's in jail for a crime he didn't commit. I'm like, what good can come from that? But what is interesting, every time Joseph rises to above the challenge, and something happens. And this is not just a case of looking back and saying like, oh, like looking back at this crisis in my life, now I can learn something from it. Now I can grow through it. So he's not just looking back and growing through the pain that he experienced. In the moment that he's experiencing the pain, in his moment of discomfort, he's growing. And when I look at his story, and I think of all of these marathon runners that I spoke about, when I think of Joseph, the ups and downs, when I think of my own life, the ups and downs, something that I have realized over and over again is that it's not necessarily the hardship, the pain, or the discomfort in our life that makes or breaks us, but our attitude towards the hardship, the pain, and the suffering that we often go through. You see, Joseph had many, many opportunities to have given up. He had many opportunities where his pain could have crushed him. But he knew that discomfort was underrated. And he used them to his advantage. And today what I want to do is, I'm going to look at 4 simple steps that I believe 4 attitudes that we can have in life, that we can help ourselves to have, that we can make a decision that this is going to be my outlook in life, that will help me to grow through discomfort instead of break because of the discomfort. And the first one, to get through any pain, you first need to refuse to quit. This seems so ridiculously simple that you're like, why is that even on the screen? Because it's one of the hardest things for us to do when we get to the lowest point that we can be. Joseph had many opportunities where he could have decided to quit. When he was naked at the bottom of a pit, where he was actually still worried that his brothers might kill him because that was their initial plan, at that moment he could have quit. When he was sold to slave traders and put on the back of a camel, he could have quit. When he was sold to Potiphar, he could have quit. When he ended up in jail for a crime he didn't commit, he could have quit. But each time, he refused to quit. If you have ever, we had our mental health week a while ago, and that's something that came up there as well. Often, I think the hardest part for us when we really hit a low point in our life, the hardest part for us is just to get up in the morning. And therefore, I think the first and the most simple attitude we can have in life is, I am not quitting, no matter what. I read a study of a doctor in South Africa, Dr. Jerome Swartz, and he works at the Sports Science Institute of South Africa. And he said something really interesting, because when I would watch these runners run by, like you have this little pack of tiny little dudes, like sprinting for 50 kilometers. They're not even breathing heavily. And then an hour later, the race comes. And I'm like, what is up with this? Is this genes? Like, what's going on? And he did a huge study, and he said something that elite athletes have an easy time. But that's a wrong assumption. It never gets easier as your time improves. You hurt just as much. It doesn't get easier when you conquer the pit to then conquer the prison. It's still hard. It still hurts. It's hard to conquer every single difficulty in our life. It's not that some people just have this natural ability to push through pain. Although I think some women do. That's why Jesus made them to give birth and not men, right? But he said accepting the reality of pain leads to a more realistic expectation and faster times. Knowing how to accept the reality of pain allows people to improve their performance. So this is what he's saying. If you expect your life to be without pain, this was for sport, but I'm interpreting this for your life, okay? If you expect your life to be without pain, you've already lost the fight. There will be pain. And by expecting pain, by expecting discomfort, you set yourself up with an attitude that says, I refuse to quit no matter what happens. He said there's another trick that some people try, probably the guys that came an hour later, and he said that is dissociation from pain, where you kind of like try to just block it out, like, this is not happening to me. He says, and it only works temporarily. So for a moment, they could block it out, but what he discovered was that the best long-distance athletes concentrated even more intensely on their running when they experienced pain. He said the best athletes don't avoid pain, they push into it and past it. You see, here is the problem with us in everyday life. When we experience pain, there's a certain threshold that we think we can survive, but if it goes anything above it, I'm like, I can't do this, and I'm just going to quit. Guys, you don't just run 56 kilometers without experiencing any pain. No matter what you eat, how much you sleep, or how good you train, you are going to be in pain. But these guys embraced it, and that helped them to be even better in their pursuit of that end line. And often I think the problem for us is that we quit before we see the breakthrough that God wanted to bring in our lives. We quit before we're taken out of the pit. We quit before we are in charge of Potiphar's house. We quit before the Pharaoh puts us in charge of the whole of Egypt, because that's what later happened in Joseph's life. We quit before the breakthrough. And therefore, the first challenge that I want to tell you is to make a decision to not quit no matter what. You don't have to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Okay, some people do. I'm a future-oriented person, so I always see a light at the end of the tunnel. It has happened to me once in my life twice, where I couldn't see a light. You don't always have to see a light at the end of the tunnel. You don't always have to see a better picture. The first thing is, I am not going to quit till I'm in the light on the other side. The first thing you do is you get up every morning, you make your bed, you brush your teeth, and you continue. And you trust God that His grace will be enough to sustain you. First lesson that I learned from Joseph. Second lesson, second attitude. Change what you can and leave the rest up to God. The other way to say it is change what you can and don't worry about the rest. Could Joseph change anything about him being in the pit? No, he couldn't. It was clearly too tall for him, the walls of that pit to get out of. Could Joseph change anything about being in prison? He couldn't. He was put there unfairly. He couldn't get out. There wasn't proper judgment about his life. So he was in prison. He couldn't change that. But he changed what he could change. So when he arrived in Potiphar's house, he lived the purpose that God gave him to live. And that was to organize things, to make sense of things that other people couldn't make sense of. And suddenly he rose to the challenge that God put in charge of the house. When he was in prison, and you can go and read this week when you continue to read the story, two of the king's servants, a baker, and what's the English word for the guys drinking? Cupbearer, thank you. My English sometimes runs out. But the cupbearer are in prison with Joseph, and they have these crazy dreams. And Joseph still couldn't change anything about the prison situation, but he does what he can. And he tells them, because God revealed it to him, what the dreams mean. Because of that, he ends up in front of the Pharaoh. You see, so he changed the things he could, and he didn't worry about the rest. He didn't try to change the things he had no control over. And that's a problem for the human spirit, right? We want to be in control of every single area of our life. The reality is we are not. And you are not. And when we are so focused on trying to change the things we can change, the situations that are outside of my control, it will consume you and it will bury your life. Don't lie awake about things outside of your control and power. Don't lie awake about the possibility of a recession or the state of the world. That is not things you can change. Change what you can. I was listening this week to a podcast, dad and a daughter team that wrote a book together about our thought processes. And the daughter, McCrae Acuff, she's 16 years old, and the interviewer, Kieran, asked her, like, when you face these challenges, when like bad thoughts pop up and whatever, what do you do? Like, what's your process of how do you change things you can change? And she said her process is Jeeps. Now, if you're from the UK, you would think it should be a Land Rover because they're the best 4x4s. But if you're in the US, you're like, no, it's a Jeep, right? A Wrangler. So she said Jeeps. That's her answer to conquer mountains. J is for Jesus. E is for eating. The other E is for exercise. P is for people. And S is for sleep. So she said, whenever I feel like the world is out of control, when my thoughts spin out of control, when I think like I'm at the bottom of the pit, I control what I can. And what is that? I can control how much time I spend with Jesus. I can make sure that I fill my tank. The second thing is I can make sure that I eat healthy food and not bury myself in ice cream. I sometimes do that, but not anymore. I can control how my exercise, make sure I get rid of all of these hormones and things through good exercise, right? I can control what people I hang out with, people like this family that breathe life into you. And I can make sure about my sleep, that I sleep enough. I was like, that is such a good, simple way to say, change what you can and trust God with the rest. Joseph did what he could, and he trusted God with the rest. But the third step is have a vision for a future bigger than yourself. If you were here last week, or if you've read the story, you will remember that the story of Joseph starts with the dream he had. And then another dream. A dream of his brothers and his father bowing before him. And I wonder if that's not part of the reason why Joseph could conquer all of these challenges he faced. I think part of the reason why he could face it was because he didn't see himself as a prisoner, as a slave, as a nobody at the bottom of a pit. He had a vision for a future that was bigger than his current circumstances, than the pain that he was facing in his life. We may not always see it clearly. We might not like the process of getting where we should be. But if we want to survive, we need to be convinced that the pain that I'm enduring today will someday be worth it. And every time when I'm able to conquer a little bit of pain, when I'm able to conquer the pit, when I'm able to conquer this moment of just being a slave, when I'm able to conquer the prison, what happens is every time we conquer, we raise our threshold of pain. Just like those marathon runners. It was little bits that they had to increase to finally get to a place where they could run 56 Ks. I joked about pregnancy, but when my wife was pregnant, both times and our girls were born, we were too late for proper pain meds. And I would look at my tiny little wife in this incredible pain, and the next day she's walking around and taking care of a baby. And I'm like, this is weird. Like if I was in that much pain the next day, I would be in hospital on a drip, I think. But it is incredible when you speak to a mother, like she would have a child and she would have another child and maybe another child. And I'm like, how can you keep doing that if you're in this much pain? Because there's a vision for something better, right? The pain is worth it because there's new life that comes out of it. But if we don't see the new life on the other side of our pain will trap us. It helps us to build resilience when we've got a vision of the future. Joseph, if you go and read the rest of his story, tells the cupbearer what the dream is. He tells it to servants of the king. And then he says these words. He's like, when you get out of jail, remember me and tell the Pharaoh about me. Do you think they did it? Nope. And 2 more years after they have been released, he sits in prison. Like, when do we break? That could have broken him. But I think because of the resilience that he's built through pain and because of the picture that he had for the future, his pain never broke him. And I want to tell you, our perspective about tomorrow radically affects how we respond to today. Our perspective of tomorrow radically affects how we respond to today. And I don't know if you're a Christian or not, but let me tell you, the beauty of knowing Jesus and being a Christian means that I've got a vision of a future that surpasses just this life. So although I have hope for this life, that I know God says, I've got a plan for you, I've got a future not to harm you, but to prosper you. Although I'm holding on to that, even if everything comes crashing down in this life, there is a life that will be so much better than this life after this has ended. Because in Jesus, we have eternal life. This is not the end. And C.S. Lewis, I can't even remember the quote, but he said something like that, where he said, people who understand, it's something in this line, don't quote me on this, but people who understand eternity the most will make the biggest difference in this world. Because our perspective about tomorrow will affect how we respond today. So once you say, I'm not going to quit no matter what. Once you've taken the steps to change what you can and leave the rest up to God. Once you have started to understand that there is a future that God has planned for you, if you're not done, if you're not dead, God's not done with you. He still has a purpose for your life. No matter if you're lying in bed today and watching this online because you don't have the courage to get up, He's not done with you. And He's got a plan for you. But once you've done that, the fourth attitude that we need to have is to remember that God is not against you, but He's with you in your moments of pain. Can you remember what we read? Joseph was in prison, but the Lord. It could have been easy for Joseph in those moments to have said, clearly, God can't be for me. Yes, He's given me dreams. He's given me an idea of the future, but clearly He's not for me because look at all these crises. My own family tried to kill me, then sold me, then I was a slave. Now I'm in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Clearly, God must be against me, right? And often that is something that I hear when people go through hard times. They're like, Louis, is this evidence that what's going on in my life is how God is feeling about me? And I want to tell you, no. Your personal circumstances, the pain you're going through, the hardship you're facing, the discomfort you're in, do not coincide with how God feels about you. And this is the biggest lie the devil will try to sell you. He will try to make you believe that what you're going through now is because that's how God feels about you. That God is against you, that God hates you, that God is disappointed in you, that God does not care about you. But there is proof of how God feels about you. A proof that speaks much louder than the pain you and I will ever go through. And that is the cross of Jesus. When you're tempted to conclude that God doesn't care about you, you need to look at the cross. When you believe that God is against you, you need to look at the cross. Because in that moment on the cross, God poured out all the evil, all the sin, all the horror, all the pain and the brokenness on His sinless Son. And there has never and there will never be a greater act of love than God Himself coming to earth and dying on a cross for people like me and you who were enemies of God, who didn't even know Him. But still He's like, I'll take everything on me for your sake. That is the ultimate statement of His affection for us. And you and I might not know the reason for our pain and our discomfort and our hardship. But we can be sure of one thing. And that is, it's not because God doesn't care. He has proven His love beyond any doubt on that cross. When He died for me, and when He died for you. God never abandons us. Even when we're in a deep, dark pit, and we can't sense Him there with us. Even when we're being dragged off by a bunch of slave traders, even when we end up as a slave in someone's home, when we are in prison for crimes we didn't commit, when we feel like bars are all around us and I'm trapped in a situation, God has not abandoned us, not no, because He didn't abandon Joseph. God sometimes does deliver us from our pain. But He doesn't always deliver us from our pain. But He does always deliver us through it. Because He doesn't abandon us. Throughout Joseph's story, you keep reading these words that he was in a pit, that he was a slave, that he was in jail, that he was forgotten, but God. When we trust God in difficult times, our stumbling blocks that you thought is the end become stepping stones. So I want to end with the last little piece that I want to read about what happened to him after some more years in jail. But I want to recap that, right? What was the attitude that he had? One, he said, I'm never going to quit. Two, I'm going to change what I can. I'm going to leave the rest up to God. Three, I'm going to have a vision for a future beyond my pain, whether in this life or the next. And four, I'm never going to believe the lie that He's against me. Joseph was in jail for a couple of years. Finally, Pharaoh had a dream that no one could tell him what it means. And then suddenly, the guys are like, oh, there was this guy in prison, and we promised we'll remember him. And it's 2 years later, but now we remember him. And they told Pharaoh about him, and Joseph got all dressed up and cleaned up, and Joseph went to the Pharaoh, and then he told the Pharaoh what the dream means. And this is what happened. Verse 37. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man? Hear these words. Not the smartest man in the world, not the most resilient. That's all things he were. But he says, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than you. As long as you see your failure, as long as you see the stress you're going through, as long as you see difficulties and pain as intruders, you'll fail to let it teach and shape and strengthen you. There is victory on the other side of our crisis. And God had a plan with Joseph all along. And when we expect God to use pain to sift us and to prune us and to build us, we'll have the tenacity it takes to endure hard times. So allow discomfort to make you yearn for something more. Allow it to change you, to adapt you, to strengthen you, to stretch you. Allow it to bring you closer to God. But do not allow it to be your end. And do not allow it to make you believe God is against you. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for incredible stories like these of Joseph. Little bits of history of how you walked with people throughout the ages. Stories that remind us if that happened in Joseph's life, it can be true for my life as well. I pray for every person listening to this today feels defeated, abandoned, like failures, feels like they've reached their end, feels like they're facing uphill battles, feels stressed out, depleted. I pray, God, that in you we will find strength to push past the greatest challenges of life. I pray that you will stretch us and grow us, and that you will bring us through our hardship and pain for your glory. May we never give up. May we give our best in the things we have control over. May we trust you to give us a vision of the future and to carry us through this pain. Pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.